Hi everyone, my name is Harriet Thomson, and today I'd like to talk to you about data politics and ethics. So our starting point is that statistical data is often seen as unbiased and trustworthy, and particularly so when compared to qualitative forms of data, it's seen as more reliable or objective. But the key point that I would like to make in this talk is that data are not objective. They are never neutral. We first, however, have to unpick the concept of objectivity, which is drawn from the contested concept of positivism, which argues that knowledge is generated in this detached scientific method, and thus the findings of research do not depend on who did the research. However, the idea of objectivity is rejected by researchers from critical and interpretivist standpoints. Indeed, constructivism argues that humans are active creators of their own knowledge, and when something new is encountered, the recipients have to integrate it with previous ideas and experiences. Thus, research is always shaped in some way by individual researchers. And when we apply this to the design, processing, and analysis of data, we start to see the myriad ways in which biases can be introduced. So many data design and processing decisions are hidden from data users, particularly for official forms of data. This makes it all the more important to ask questions like who or what is excluded from data sources. Do you trust the data producers? And what are the potential biases? For example, if we consider official estimates of, say, air pollution monitoring, this data is usually collected by local level governments who have control over the location of monitors, and they could choose to place them in areas where the air quality is higher, perhaps away from areas of high traffic. In addition, monitoring equipment can fail and is also vulnerable to external interference. Or if we think about household surveys and self-reported data on energy consumption, we have to take into consideration issues such as the accuracy of recall, seasonal variation in energy usage, the accuracy of electricity billing versus actual energy consumption, and whether all energy carriers are included. We also have to take into consideration that national surveys often have incomplete population coverage due to the systematic exclusion of certain groups, which is termed non-households. So this includes geographically mobile and nomadic populations, people displaced by war, those living in institutional settings such as care homes and hospitals, those who are homeless, and people in prison. And this matters because the excluded groups are people who are often already marginalised within society, and they're marginalised by policy design. And yet we know relatively little about their situations. And in 2015, more than 300 million people were estimated to be missing from sampling frames worldwide, which is a situation that will vary from country to country, depending on specific cultural differences concerning things like imprisonment and how the elderly are cared for. In most instances, the non-household population represents a very small proportion of a country's overall population. So in the UK, it's estimated to only be around 2%, for example. And so it may not be a high priority for addressing. At the same time, some countries may deliberately choose to exclude marginalised populations for political reasons, as has happened in Myanmar and India, among others. But supposing that we do want to address this gap in sampling, how can we include hard-to-reach groups? Well, numerous proposals have been made, And there's two excellent reports listed at the bottom there by Bramley and colleagues, by Chavez Villegas and Saman. Suggestions include creating bespoke surveys, piggybacking onto existing data collection infrastructure by adding new questions, or combining multiple sources of existing data. Other proposals include using action-based sampling, in which the focus is surveying people when they engage with key services, or more controversially, doing retrospective data collection, where people who have previously been classified as a non-household population, for example, people who have previously been homeless, are surveyed as if they were still part of that non-household population. It's important to keep in mind that all of these approaches have their limitations and risks. As well as thinking through which groups are excluded from data infrastructure, we also have to think about who is potentially being exploited. In recent years, there have been some high-profile big data breaches by multinational companies such as eBay, and misuse of data for political purposes by Facebook. There have also been examples of extractive research within vulnerable communities. For example, Disney Pixar based Coco on a real family in Mexico who they photographed and interviewed during research trips. But this family was not acknowledged in the film, nor did they receive any financial reimbursement from Disney Pixar, despite Disney earning more than $800 million from Coco. Now, obviously, these examples are quite far removed from the reality for most individual researchers. But it's important to note that consent and ownership issues can also arise on a smaller scale. One pertinent example is in the use of publicly accessible forms of data, such as tweets posted on Twitter or comments on open internet forums. So these textual data are mostly created without the creative thinking that it will get used for research. So there are ethical issues arising for research that uses these data forms. And once data has been created, we then have to carefully consider how to analyse the data responsibly. So the overall aim is to be true to original data using appropriate analysis techniques, by which I mean not manipulating the data to get a different answer or misrepresenting people's views. As part of these considerations, we need to keep in mind that the scholarship on metrics tells us that all indicators risk silencing important but difficult to measure aspects and simultaneously privileging other aspects. So the choice of indicator and subsequent interpretation of findings also carries important implications for political and policy discourses, depending on which groups are highlighted as most in need of support or which technology is shown to be most effective under certain conditions. To give a real-life example, this table shows that slightly different definitions of energy poverty produce completely different distributions of energy poverty across household types. In this example, England's previous official government definition is shown in the middle column, and in the last column, a slightly modified definition is shown, which uses a different income concept, basic income. So this is the income that a household receives from employment and welfare benefits, whereas full income is this income plus money related to housing, such as housing support benefits. Under the earlier official government definition, around 50% of the energy poor were elderly households, and whereas less than 20% of the energy poor were couples with children. But by slightly modifying the definition of income, these two groups more or less switch places. Our job as researchers is to then unpick which household groups are more vulnerable and to question why the government might choose to prioritise elderly households over other groups. So having sat through this presentation, you might be asking yourself, how can I make sure I'm conducting ethically responsible research? And the answer in simple terms is to be reflective and critical at all stages of the research process. This should involve asking yourself and team members whether the research is compliant with current best practice and regulation, recognising, of course, that this varies from country to country and also among disciplines. Next, what is my impact on society? Will the research make a positive or negative contribution? And lastly, how can I minimise the risk of harm to participants, and especially to marginalised groups, in the design, use, and potential exploitation of research activities and outputs? So to end, thank you for listening, and here you can find listed a range of further reading in case you want to know more about the topic. So thank you.